He told her she was worthless. He told the judge she was a leech who deserved nothing. For 6 months, Richard dragged his wife, Henry, through the mud, hiding millions in offshore accounts and mocking her tears in the courtroom. He thought he had won. He thought he had broken her. But he didn't know who was waiting for her outside. He didn't know that the woman he called pathetic was about to step into a black SUV with the one man Richard feared more than anyone on earth. When the window rolled down, Richard's smirk didn't just fade, it died. This is the story of the most satisfying regret you will ever witness. The fluorescent lights of the mediation room hummed with an irritating buzz, but it was nothing compared to the noise coming from the man sitting across the mahogany table. Richard Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, checking his Rolex for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. He didn't just look bored, he looked victorious. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy suit that cost more than most people's cars, a silent testament to the wealth he had amassed during their 12-year marriage, wealth he was currently fighting tooth and nail to keep entirely for himself. "Are we done yet?" Richard sighed, looking at his lawyer, a shark of a man named Mr. Henderson. "I have a flight to catch. Unlike some people in this room, I actually have a business to run." Across from him sat Henry. She looked tired. Her blonde hair, usually kept in a neat bun, was slightly frayed at the edges. She wore a simple grey cardigan and jeans, a stark contrast to Richard's polished dominance. She hadn't said a word for the last hour, her eyes fixed on the stack of documents in front of her. Henry, her lawyer, a court-appointed mediator named Brenda, whispered gently, "If you sign this, you are waiving your right to the tech startup shares. You are accepting the bare minimum alimony. Are you sure you understand?" Richard laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Of course she understands, Brenda. She knows her place. She contributed nothing to Sterling Dynamics. She stayed home, she cooked, she cleaned. You don't get equity for doing laundry." Henry's hand trembled slightly as she held the pen. "I just want it to be over," Henry said, her voice barely a whisper. "See?" Richard smirked, tapping the table with his knuckles. "She's sensible. She knows she can't afford to fight me. My legal team would bury her under so much paperwork. She'd be bankrupt before the first hearing." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a cruel, intimate volume. "Face it, Henry. You're nothing without me. You're 42 years old. You haven't worked a real job in a decade. And let's be honest, who's going to look at you now? You should be thanking me for the alimony I'm generous enough to give." Henry looked up. For a split second, there was something in her eyes that Richard couldn't place. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It looked almost like pity. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She looked down and signed the papers. Scritch, scratch. The sound seemed to echo in the silence of the room. "Done," Henry said, pushing the papers across the table. Richard snatched them up, scanning the signature to make sure it was legitimate. A wide, predatory grin spread across his face. He handed them to Henderson, who slipped them into a briefcase with a satisfied nod. "Smart girl," Richard said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "You saved yourself a lot of humiliation. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a celebration dinner to attend. Alone. Well, not entirely alone." He winked at his lawyer. Everyone in town knew about Richard's assistant, a 24-year-old named Jessica, who had been the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. Henry stood up slowly. She gathered her purse, a worn leather bag she'd had for years. "Goodbye, Richard," she said. Her voice was steady now, stronger. "Goodbye?" No, Richard chuckled, walking toward the door. "This is good riddance." "Oh, and Henry." Try not to spend that alimony check all at one place. I'd hate to see you begging on the street in a month." He walked out the door, laughing. He felt invincible. He had won. He had kept the company, the house, the cars, and the offshore accounts he was sure she knew nothing about. He had no idea that Henry had signed those papers not because she was weak, but because she was in a hurry. She needed to be free, because she had a meeting to get to, and she wasn't the one who was going to be begging. Richard stepped out of the law firm's building and took a deep breath of the city air. It smelled like victory. He pulled out his phone and dialed Jessica. "It's done, babe," he said, his voice booming so loudly that passers-by turned to look. "She signed everything. The company is safe. The house is safe. She took the peanuts and ran." He paused, listening to the squeal of excitement on the other end. I know. I'm a genius. Listen, meet me at Le Pierre in 20 minutes. I'm going to buy the most expensive bottle of champagne they have. We're celebrating freedom." He hung up and signaled for his driver. As he waited on the curb, he saw Henry exit the building behind him. He couldn't resist one last jab. He wanted to see her break. He wanted the satisfaction of seeing her cry on the sidewalk. "Hey!" Richard shouted, turning around. Henry stopped. She was checking her phone, looking unbothered. This annoyed him. "You need a ride," Richard called out, mocking concern. "I can have my driver drop you off at the bus station. Or are you walking? It's a nice day for a walk. Good exercise. You could use it." Mr. Henderson, standing next to Richard, chuckled nervously. "Richard, let it go. You won." "I just want to be helpful," Richard sneered. "It's a tough world out there for a single, middle-aged woman with no skills." Henry finally looked at him. She lowered her sunglasses, revealing eyes that were ice cold. "I don't need a ride, Richard," she said, calm. "My ride is here." Richard looked around. The street was busy with yellow taxis and beat-up sedans. "What ride? An Uber pool?" He laughed at his own joke. "Save your money, Henry. Really?" Just then, the traffic on the busy street seemed to part. A low rumble, deep and powerful, vibrated through the pavement. Around the corner, a vehicle appeared. It wasn't a taxi. It wasn't an Uber. It was a Rolls-Royce Phantom. But not just any Phantom. It was the extended wheelbase model, custom painted in a midnight blue that looked almost black. The chrome grille gleamed under the afternoon sun like the gates of a fortress. It moved with a silent, heavy grace, commanding the road. Richard stopped laughing. He knew cars. He knew that car cost upwards of $500,000. He stared at it, admiring the machinery. "Wow," he muttered. "Now that is a car. Wonder who's in town. Probably a Saudi prince or a tech mogul." The massive car slowed down. It didn't pass them. It pulled up right to the curb, directly in front of where Henry was standing. Richard frowned. "What is this?" "Henry, move out of the way. You're blocking the entrance for whoever this is." Henry didn't move. The driver's door opened. A man in a sharp black suit stepped out. He was built like a linebacker, with an earpiece coiled behind his ear. He walked around the back of the car, ignoring Richard completely, and stopped in front of Henry. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the driver said, bowing his head slightly. "I apologize for the delay. Traffic on Fifth Avenue was terrible." Richard's jaw dropped. He blinked, trying to process what he was seeing. "Ma'am, it's fine, David," Henry said softly. "We're right on time." The driver reached for the rear door handle. "Wait a minute." Richard stepped forward, confusion turning into aggression. "What is this? Who are you? Henry, who is paying for this? You can't afford a rental like this." The driver turned to Richard. His expression was stone. He didn't say a word, but he stepped between Richard and Henry, creating a physical wall. "Henry!" Richard shouted over the driver's shoulder. "You're spending your alimony already. You're trying to make me jealous by renting a fancy car for an hour. That is pathetic, even for you." Henry paused with her hand on the open door. She turned back to Richard. "It's not a rental, Richard," she said. "Bullshit," Richard spat. "You have nothing. I made sure of it." "You made sure I had nothing of yours," she corrected him. "I never said I didn't have anything of my own." Before Richard could respond, the tinted window of the back seat rolled down. Richard looked inside. He expected to see an empty seat, or maybe some low-level lawyer she was dating. Instead, he saw a man. The man was in his 50s, with silver hair and a face that was plastered on the cover of Forbes and Wall Street Journal at least twice a year. He was wearing a casual sweater that probably cost more than Richard's suit. He was looking at a tablet, but as the window lowered, he looked up. Richard's blood ran cold. He knew that face. Everyone in the business world knew that face. It was Arthur Sterling, no relation to Richard, but a god in the industry. Arthur Sterling was the CEO of Orion Global, a private equity firm that bought companies like Richard's for breakfast and sold them for scrap by lunch. He was worth billions. Richard felt his knees go weak. Why is Henry getting into a car with Arthur Sterling? Arthur looked at Richard. His eyes were dark and piercing. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He looked at Richard the way a human looks at an insect. "Ready to go, Henry?" Arthur asked, his voice deep and smooth. "Yes, Arthur," Henry said, sliding into the leather seat next to him. "Wait." Richard lunged forward, his business instincts kicking in over his shock. "Mr. Sterling. Arthur Sterling. I'm Richard. Richard Sterling. No relation, obviously. But I own Sterling Dynamics. I've been trying to get a meeting with your acquisition team for months." Arthur Sterling didn't even blink. He looked at Henry. "Is this the ex-husband?" Arthur asked. Henry nodded. "That's him." Arthur turned his gaze back to Richard. "I know who you are, Richard. We've seen your financials and your acquisition requests." Richard's heart soared. This was it. A connection. "Yes. We have incredible growth potential. If we could just sit down and—" "We passed," Arthur cut him off. "And after seeing how you treat your partners, I'm removing Sterling Dynamics from our watch list permanently. I don't do business with men who don't know the value of loyalty." "What?" Richard stammered. "But wait, how do you know—" "Driver," Arthur said. The driver slammed the heavy door shut, sealing Henry and the billionaire inside. Richard stood on the sidewalk, mouth open, as the Rolls-Royce pulled away, merging seamlessly into the traffic. "What just happened?" Mr. Henderson asked, coming up beside him, looking equally terrified. "Richard, was that the Arthur Sterling?" Richard didn't answer. He was staring at the tail lights of the car. "She knows him," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "How does she know him?" His phone buzzed. It was a text from Jessica. "I ordered the champagne." "Where are you?" Richard stared at the phone. The joy of his victory was gone, replaced by a cold, gnawing pit in his stomach. He had just seen his pathetic ex-wife drive off with a man who could buy Richard's entire life with the change in his pocket. He didn't know it yet, but the divorce papers he had just celebrated signing were not his victory. They were his death warrant. The interior of the Rolls-Royce was a sanctuary of silence and soft leather, a stark contrast to the sterile, hostile atmosphere of the mediation room Henry had just left. As the car glided onto the highway, putting distance between her and Richard, Henry finally let out the breath she had been holding for 6 months. Her shoulders slumped. She covered her face with her hands. "Are you okay?" Arthur asked gently. The ruthlessness he had shown Richard on the curb was gone, replaced by a deep, familial concern. He reached into a cooler built into the center console and pulled out a bottle of sparkling water. Henry took it, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm fine. It's finally over." He signed. He really thinks he won. Arthur let out a low, humorless laugh. Let him think that for a few more days. It makes the fall so much more entertaining. He looked at her, his expression softening. "I still don't understand how you did it, Henry. 12 years. 12 years pretending to be Henry Miller, the simple housewife. 12 years of letting a mediocrity like Richard talk down to you, treat you like an accessory, and count pennies while you sat on a fortune that could buy his entire bloodline." Henry looked out the window, watching the city skyline blur. "I loved him, Arthur. In the beginning, I really did. I didn't want him to love me for the sterling money. I didn't want him to look at me the way everyone else does, as a walking bank account. I wanted to be loved for me." Arthur sighed, shaking his head. "And so you became Henry Miller. You took Mum's maiden name. You lived in that modest house. You let him budget your grocery money." He clenched his fist. "God, when I saw the transcripts of what he said in court, calling you a leech, I almost bought his building just to evict him then and there." "I know," Henry said softly. "But I had to follow the plan. If he knew who I really was, he would have dragged the divorce out for decades. He would have fought for half of my trust. He would have wanted a seat on the board of Orion Global." She turned to Arthur, her eyes hardening. "I needed him to think I was destitute. I needed him to think he was discarding trash. That was the only way to get him to sign the waiver. He waived all rights to any future assets or hidden assets I might possess. It's ironclad." Arthur smiled, a wicked glint in his eye. "Ironclad. Henderson is a cheap lawyer, but even he should have checked your background deeper than a credit report. They never looked for the trust fund because they assumed you were a nobody." He tapped the tablet in his lap. "So, now that you are officially divorced and the waiver is filed, are you ready to come back to the world of the living?" Henry straightened up. She adjusted her cardigan, but suddenly it felt like a costume she was ready to burn. "I'm done being Henry Miller, the housewife," she said firmly. "I'm ready to be Henry Sterling again." Arthur nodded approvingly. "Good, because we have a board meeting on Monday, and there's a certain acquisition target on the agenda that I think you'll want to handle personally." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Which company?" Arthur turned the tablet screen toward her. Displayed on the screen was a dossier. The photo at the top was of a sleek, modern office building. The logo was familiar. Too familiar. Sterling Dynamics. "Richard's company," Henry whispered. "He's over-leveraged," Arthur explained, his voice turning into the cold monotone of a business titan. "He took out massive loans to expand last year, banking on a contract with the military that he didn't get. He's been cooking the books to hide the losses from you during the divorce, so he wouldn't have to split the debt. But now, the banks are getting nervous. They're looking for a buyer to take on the debt in exchange for equity." Henry looked at the numbers. It was a mess. Richard was a good salesman, but a terrible CEO. He was bleeding money. "He bragged about keeping the company," Henry said, a small, cold smile touching her lips. "He told the judge it was his life's work." "And now," Arthur said, closing the tablet case with a snap, "it's going to be yours. We aren't just going to buy it, Henry. We're going to execute a hostile takeover. And since you own 40% of Orion Global's voting shares, you're going to be the one to sign the purchase order." Henry looked at her hands. The ring finger was empty. The weight of the diamond Richard had given her, bought with money she had helped him save, was gone. "He told me I was nothing without him," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "He told me I couldn't survive in the real world." "He was wrong," Arthur said. "Yes," Henry agreed. She looked at her brother. "Take me to the estate. I need to change. I can't destroy my ex-husband wearing clothes from Target." 2 hours later, Richard was seated at the best table in Le Pierre, a French restaurant where the waiters spoke better English than the patrons, but refused to use it. Across from him sat Jessica. She was 24, beautiful in a way that required high maintenance, and currently scrolling through Instagram while Richard poured her a glass of Dom Perignon. "To us," Richard said, raising his glass, "and to total victory." Jessica barely looked up. "Did you see the car he was driving? The guy who picked up your ex?" Richard's mood soured instantly. He slammed his glass down a little too hard. "It doesn't matter, Jessica. It was probably a taxi service. Or maybe she's dating a chauffeur. Who cares? She's the past. We are the future." Jessica shrugged, finally taking a sip. "I just think it's weird. You said she was broke. Broke people don't get picked up in phantoms." "Drop it," Richard snapped. He took a long drink, trying to wash away the memory of Arthur Sterling's cold stare. Why was he there? The question had been gnawing at him all afternoon. Maybe Henry had been a nanny for the Sterlings years ago. Maybe she was a distant cousin of a maid. His phone buzzed on the white tablecloth. Richard glanced at it. It was Gorski. Ivan Gorski was Richard's biggest client. His logistics firm accounted for nearly 60% of Sterling Dynamics revenue. If Gorski sneezed, Richard caught a cold. "I have to take this," Richard said, holding up a finger to Jessica. He put on his charming business voice. "Ivan, my friend, I'm actually at dinner celebrating a major legal victory, but for you I always have time. Tell me, are we ready to sign the renewal for Q3? There was a silence on the other end, a heavy, uncomfortable silence. "Richard?" Ivan's voice was rough, lacking its usual jovial tone. "We aren't renewing." Richard froze. The background noise of the restaurant, the clinking silverware, the soft jazz, seemed to vanish. "Excuse me?" Richard laughed nervously. "Ivan, you're joking. You've been with us for 5 years. Our integration is seamless. You can't just switch vendors overnight." "We aren't switching to just anyone," Yvonne said. "We've been given a directive. We're moving our logistics to a subsidiary of Orion Global." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. Orion Global, Arthur Sterling's company. "Orion?" Richard stammered. "Ivan, listen to me. They're a massive conglomerate. They don't care about you like I do. I can lower my rates. It's not about rates, Richard." Ivan cut him off. "I got a call from the VP of Orion today. They made it very clear. If I do business with Sterling Dynamics, Orion pulls their financing from my construction projects in Europe. They gave me a choice. You or my entire business empire." Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish. That's illegal. That's antitrust. They can't do that." "They can. And they did," Yvonne said. "I'm sorry, Richard. Effective immediately. Our contract is void. Don't call me again." Click. Richard stared at the phone. His hand was shaking so badly he almost dropped it into his soup. "What's wrong?" Jessica asked, looking annoyed that the attention was off her. "Did the card get declined or something?" "Shut up," Richard whispered. "Excuse me?" Jessica's eyes widened. "I said shut up," Richard hissed. "I just lost the Gorski account. That's $3 million a year. Gone." He ran a hand through his hair, messing up the perfect gel. "This makes no sense. Why would Orion Global care about a mid-sized logistics firm in Chicago? Why would Arthur Sterling target me? Then, the image flashed in his mind. The curb, the Rolls-Royce, Henry getting into the car. "Is this the ex-husband?" Arthur had asked. "I know who you are, Richard." "No," Richard muttered. "No, that's impossible. She's a housewife. She coupons. She buys generic cereal. She can't be knowing people like that." His phone buzzed again, then a third time. He looked at the screen. Missed call. Bank of America commercial lending. Email. Urgent notice of credit line review. Text from operations manager. "Boss, the server access just got revoked by the software provider. They say the license expired." It was an avalanche. It wasn't just Gorski. It was everything. "Richard, you're scaring me," Jessica said, actually looking concerned now, or perhaps concerned that her meal ticket was hyperventilating. Richard stood up abruptly, knocking his chair over. The entire restaurant turned to look. "We have to go," he said. "But we haven't even ordered entrees," Jessica whined. "I don't care about the damn entrees," Richard shouted, throwing a wad of cash onto the table. "I need to get to the office. Something is happening. Someone is attacking my company." He grabbed Jessica's arm, perhaps a bit too roughly, and pulled her toward the exit. As he waited for the valet to bring his car, a Mercedes that suddenly felt very small compared to a Rolls-Royce, Richard pulled out his phone and dialed the one number he thought could save him. He dialed Henry. It went straight to voicemail. But the voicemail greeting had changed. Instead of Henry's hesitant, soft voice saying, "Hi, you've reached Henry. Leave a message." It was a crisp, professional, automated recording. "You have reached the private line of Henry Sterling, Executive Director. Please direct all business inquiries to my assistant at Orion Global Headquarters. Goodbye." Richard dropped the phone. It clattered onto the pavement, cracking the screen. "Sterling," he whispered. "Henry. Sterling?" The valet pulled up in the Mercedes. "Sir, your car." Richard didn't move. He felt like the ground was opening up beneath him. He had spent 12 years mocking his wife for being a nobody. He had spent 6 months of divorce proceedings, hiding assets from a woman he thought was too stupid to find them. But she wasn't Henry Miller. She was Henry Sterling, and he had just declared war on a goddess. The next morning, the sun rose over the city, casting a golden light on the skyscrapers. But inside the offices of Sterling Dynamics, the mood was pitch black. Richard stormed out of the elevator at 8 a.m. sharp, looking like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His tie was slightly crooked, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He expected to see his sales team on the phones, hustling to replace the Gorski account. Instead, he saw boxes. "What is going on here?" Richard shouted, his voice echoing through the open plan office. "Why aren't you working? Why are you packing?" His VP of operations, a loyal man named Tom who had been with him since the start, walked over. Tom looked pale. "We can't work, Richard. The system is down. All of it. Email, CRM, payroll. We're locked out. Call it. Fix it," Richard screamed. "We did," Tom said quietly. "The server hosting company terminated our contract at midnight. Breach of payment terms. They wiped the cloud access." "Breach of payment? I paid them last month." "You paid them with the credit line from Citibank," Tom corrected him. "The payment bounced this morning. Citibank froze all our accounts at 9 a.m. Richard felt the room spin. He stumbled back toward his glass-walled office, the sanctuary where he usually felt like a king. But sitting in his chair was not his secretary. It was a woman in a grey suit. She had a briefcase on his desk. "Who are you?" Richard demanded, storming in. "Get out of my chair." The woman didn't stand up. She adjusted her glasses and looked at a document. Mr. Sterling, I am specialized counsel for Citibank. I'm here to serve you with a notice of default. Default? I'm not in default. Richard slammed his hand on the desk. I have 30 days to cure any missed payment. Actually, the lawyer said calmly, under the change of control clause in your loan agreement, the bank has the right to call in the full value of the loan immediately if the risk profile of the borrower changes significantly. My risk profile hasn't changed. You lost the Gorski account yesterday, she said. That account represented 60% of your revenue. Without it, you are insolvent. Furthermore, we received an anonymous tip, supported by documentation, that you have been inflating your asset values to secure these loans. That is bank fraud, Mr. Sterling. Richard's face went grey. The cooked books. He had hidden the losses to keep Henry from getting money in the divorce. He thought he was being clever. So, the lawyer stood up. You owe the bank $12 million, payable immediately. Since you do not have the liquidity, the bank has sold your debt to a third party to recoup their losses. Richard blinked. You sold my debt? To who? Who would buy $12 million of bad debt overnight? The lawyer smiled, a thin professional smile that contained no warmth. A private equity firm expressed interest late last night. They bought the note at full face value. They are your creditor now, Mr. Sterling. You don't answer to the bank anymore. You answer to them. Who? Richard whispered. Orion Global. The name hit him like a physical blow. Orion. Arthur Sterling. Richard collapsed onto the leather sofa in his office. It was a coordinated attack. It was a slaughter. They had stripped his clients, frozen his cash, and now they owned his debt. They could foreclose on the company by lunch. He pulled out his phone. He had to call Henry. He had to beg. If she was really a Sterling, maybe she had mercy. Maybe she still had that soft heart he had exploited for 12 years. He dialed. Straight to voicemail. You have reached Henry Sterling, Executive Director. He hung up. He couldn't do this over the phone. He had to go there. He had to look her in the eye. He would play the victim. He would remind her of their wedding vows. He would remind her of the dog they adopted. He would say anything, do anything, to stop the bleeding. Tom, Richard shouted at his terrified VP, cancel my meetings. I'm going to Orion Global. Richard, Tom said, pointing to the TV screen in the lobby. You might want to see this. Richard looked at the wall-mounted TV. It was tuned to CNBC. The headline scrolling across the bottom read, Breaking. Arthur Sterling announces new leadership for Orion Global's tech division. Stock surges 15%. And there, on the screen, was a photo. It was Henry. But it wasn't the Henry he knew. It wasn't the woman in the stained apron. This woman was wearing a white power suit, her hair styled in a sharp, modern cut, staring into the camera with a confidence that terrified him. The caption read, Henry Sterling returns to family empire after decade-long sabbatical. Richard stared at the screen. The woman he had called worthless yesterday was currently trending on national news. He grabbed his coat and ran for the elevator. He was going to walk into the lion's den. The headquarters of Orion Global was a fortress of glass and steel that pierced the clouds. The lobby alone was larger than Richard's entire office building. Richard approached the reception desk, sweating profusely. He had been forced to take a taxi because his company card was declined at the parking garage. I'm here to see Arthur Sterling, Richard panted. It's an emergency. I'm Richard Sterling. Tell him it's about the acquisition. The receptionist, a young man with a headset, didn't even look up. Do you have an appointment? No, Look, just call up. Tell him his brother-in-law is here. The receptionist paused. He looked at his screen, then up at Richard with a confused expression. Mr. Sterling doesn't have a brother-in-law. His sister is divorced. The file says the ex-husband is hostile entity. Richard winced. Hostile entity. Just call. Richard slammed his hand on the marble desk. Security guards near the elevators took a step forward. The receptionist sighed and typed something. Ms. Sterling's office has cleared you for entry. 40th floor. Boardroom B. Ms. Sterling. Not Arthur. Richard swallowed hard. He straightened his tie, trying to regain some semblance of the arrogance that had fueled him for so long. I can handle Henry, he told himself. She's weak. She always caves when I raise my voice. The elevator ride felt like it took hours. When the doors opened, he was met by the silence of extreme wealth. The carpets were thick, the art on the walls was original, and the air smelled of expensive espresso. He walked into Boardroom B. It was a massive room with a table that could seat 30 people. The view behind the glass walls was panoramic. The entire city lay beneath them. At the far end of the table sat Arthur Sterling. He was reading a newspaper. Richard rushed forward. Arthur! Mr. Sterling! Thank God! Look, there has been a terrible misunderstanding. You bought my debt. That's aggressive. I respect it. But we can work this out. I can restructure. I can... Arthur lowered the paper. He didn't stand up. I'm not the one you need to negotiate with, Richard, Arthur said calmly. I'm just an observer today. I promised the new director I wouldn't interfere with her first acquisition. New director? Richard froze. The heavy oak doors at the other end of the room opened. The click of heels on the hardwood floor was rhythmic, sharp, and deliberate. Henry walked in. She was wearing a tailored crimson dress that looked like armor. On her wrist was a Patek Philippe watch. Her posture was perfect. She didn't look tired. She didn't look sad. She looked powerful. She walked past Richard without looking at him, and sat at the head of the table. She opened a leather folder and placed a gold pen next to it. Only then did she look up. Sit down, Richard, she said. The voice was familiar, but the tone was new. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Richard sank into the chair opposite her. He felt small. Henry, he started, putting on his best puppy dog face. Honey, look at you. You look incredible. I always knew you had this in you. Henry didn't blink. You told the judge 3 days ago that I was, quote, a lazy leech who lacked the intellectual capacity to understand business. You told my lawyer that I would be destitute within a month without your charity. I was angry, Richard pleaded. Lawyers make you say things. It's a game, Henry. You know I didn't mean it. We had 12 years together. Doesn't that mean anything? It means everything, Henry said. It means I have 12 years of data on exactly how you operate. I know you cut corners on safety regulations. I know you mistreat your staff. I know about the offshore account in the Caymans where you hid $2 million. Money you legally stole from our joint savings. Richard went pale. You know about the Caymans? I know the account number, the routing number, and the password, Henry said, because my team owns the bank that holds it. She slid a document across the massive table. It stopped perfectly in front of him. What is this? Richard asked. That is a surrender of assets, Henry explained. Here is the situation, Richard. Orion Global now owns your debt. You are in default. We also own the building your company leases. We bought it this morning from your landlord. We are evicting you effective immediately. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. You have 2 choices. Option A. We foreclose. We seize the physical assets. We sue you personally for the $12 million. We expose the fraud in your accounting to the IRS and the SEC. You go to prison for 5 to 10 years. Richard couldn't breathe. And And option B? Option B. Henry tapped the paper. You sign the company over to me, 100% of it. In exchange, I absolve the debt. I will not press criminal charges for the fraud. You walk away. Walk away with what? Richard asked, his voice trembling. My equity? My payout? Henry smiled. It was the same smirk he had given her in the mediation room. You get nothing, Richard. You leave with the clothes on your back, just like you planned for me. I built that company, Richard shouted, standing up. It's mine. It was built on my support, Henry snapped, her voice rising for the first time, echoing off the glass walls. I managed your life. I advised you on deals you were too stupid to understand. I introduced you to clients at parties you thought I was just decorating. I built you, Richard, and now I'm taking it back. Richard looked at Arthur. Arthur just shrugged. She's the boss, Richard. I'd sign if I were you. Prison food is terrible for the complexion. Richard looked back at Henry. He saw no mercy in her eyes. He saw the reflection of a man who had made the biggest mistake of his life. He picked up the pen. His hand shook as he signed the line, scritch, scratch, the sound of his defeat. Done, Richard whispered. Henry took the paper. She checked the signature. Smart boy, she said, echoing his words from the divorce. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a company to save. Security will escort you out. The physical sensation of being escorted out of a building is something Richard Sterling had only ever seen in movies. He had always assumed it happened to other people, to thieves, to incompetent interns, to people who didn't matter. He never imagined he would feel the firm, unyielding grip of a security guard on his own bicep, guiding him not with violence, but with a humiliating, professional indifference. I can walk myself, Richard snapped, trying to shrug off the guard's hand as they marched him toward the elevator. Policy, sir, the guard replied, his voice a monotone drone. He didn't look at Richard. To him, the former CEO of Sterling Dynamics was just a package that needed to be delivered to the curb. The ride down from the 40th floor took an eternity. Richard stared at his reflection in the polished brass doors of the elevator. His tie was askew. His hair, usually gelled to perfection, was disheveled where he had run his hands through it in panic. He looked manic. He looked desperate. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who had lost everything in the span of a single morning. When the door slid open in the lobby, the humiliation deepened. This wasn't just the Orion Global lobby, it was a thoroughfare for the city's elite. And there, standing near the reception desk, was a group of his own employees, his former sales team. They were holding new visitor badges, looking around the massive atrium with wide, excited eyes. They had been summoned for an orientation with the new ownership. Richard instinctively straightened his spine. He opened his mouth to bark an order, to tell them to get back to the office, but the words died in his throat. They saw him. The conversation among the sales team stopped. 6 pairs of eyes locked onto him. Richard waited for them to rush over, to ask what was wrong, to offer help. He was their leader. He had hired them. But nobody moved. Instead, he saw something that cut deeper than any insult. He saw pity. One of the junior associates, a kid Richard had screamed at just last week for a typo, looked at the security guards flanking Richard, then looked down at his shoes, awkwardly shuffling away. The others turned their backs, pretending to study the artwork on the walls. They were distancing themselves from the sinking ship. This way, sir, the guard said, nudging him toward the revolving doors. The transition from the climate-controlled, jasmine-scented air of the Orion Tower to the biting wind of the Chicago street was a physical shock. The guard handed him a small, white cardboard box. Your personal effects from the office, Mr. Sterling. The rest will be couriered to your residence. assuming you still have access to the residence on file. The guard turned on his heel and walked back inside, leaving Richard standing alone on the cold concrete. Richard looked down at the box. It was pathetically light. He lifted the lid. Inside, rattling around like loose change, were 3 items: his lucky stapler, a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Boss," a gag gift he had bought for himself because no one else would, and a framed 4:1:6 photograph. He picked up the photo. His hands were shaking so badly the frame rattled against his wedding ring, a ring he realized he needed to pawn. The photo was from 10 years ago. It was him and Henry, standing on the pier in Santa Monica. He was wearing a cheap t-shirt, and she was laughing, her hair wind-blown, looking at him with total, unadulterated adoration. They had no money then. They had eaten hot dogs for dinner that night, and he remembered, with a sickening jolt, that he had been happy. He had traded that woman, that laughter, and that happiness for a corner office and a mistress who wouldn't answer his calls. Speaking of calls, he needed a miracle. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers numb from the cold. He dialed the one man who knew where the bodies were buried. "Henderson," Richard hissed into the phone as soon as the line connected. "Don't hang up. You're my lawyer. You have a fiduciary duty." "I have a duty to clients who pay their retainers, Richard." Mr. Henderson's voice was clipped, devoid of the sycophantic warmth it usually held. "I'll pay you. I have money in the Caymans. Henry knows about it. But if we move fast, we can—" "Richard, stop!" Henderson cut him off. "You don't get it. You don't understand who you were married to. I just got a call from the Bar Association. Someone flagged my firm for an ethics review regarding your divorce filings. Do you know who sits on the ethics board?" Richard didn't answer. "Arthur Sterling," Henderson whispered, the fear palpable even over the phone line. "You didn't just divorce a housewife, Richard. You declared war on an institution. You are radioactive. If I represent you, my firm is dead by Monday. Do not call me again." The line went dead. Richard lowered the phone. He felt lightheaded. The city noise, the honking taxis, the construction drills, the chatter of pedestrians seemed to blur into a deafening roar. He stumbled back, leaning against the cold stone of the building for support. He was waiting for an Uber he couldn't afford, hoping the credit card linked to the account hadn't been cancelled yet, when the heavy glass doors of the building slid open again. A hush seemed to fall over the sidewalk. Even the doormen straightened up. Henry walked out. She wasn't alone. She was flanked by Tom, his former VP, and 2 other executives from Sterling Dynamics. But the dynamic had completely shifted. In the past, Tom walked behind Richard, carrying his files, head bowed in submission. Now Tom walked beside Henry, gesturing animatedly, laughing at something she said. Henry looked radiant. The crimson dress she wore was vibrant against the grey city backdrop. She looked like a flame. She moved with a purpose and grace that Richard had never seen in their kitchen. Or perhaps, he realized with a pang of nausea, he had just never looked hard enough to see it. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, wrapping her coat tighter around herself. She said something to Tom, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Tom beamed, looking more motivated in 10 seconds of her presence than he had in 10 years of Richard's management. Then she turned. Her eyes found him immediately. There was no searching, no hesitation. She knew exactly where he would be. She said a few words to the executives, dismissing them. They walked away, casting wary glances at Richard, but knowing better than to interfere. Henry walked over to him. The click of her heels on the pavement sounded like the ticking of a clock, counting down the seconds of his life. "You're still here," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was calm, lacking the shrillness he had always accused her of having during their arguments. It was the voice of a woman who had nothing left to prove. "I'm waiting for a car," Richard lied. He tried to straighten his jacket, to salvage some scrap of dignity. "My driver got held up." "There is no driver, Richard," Henry said softly. She looked down at the cardboard box in his hands. "Just like there is no company. Just like there is no Jessica." Richard flinched at the name. You know?" "I know she posted a photo from a yacht in Miami 20 minutes ago," Henry said, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "Tagging a 22-year-old crypto promoter. You were a stepping stone, Richard, and when you stopped being solid ground, she stepped off." "I did it for us," Richard blurted out, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "I wanted to build an empire for us." "No." Henry shook her head slowly. "You wanted an audience. You didn't want a partner, Richard. You wanted a fan. You wanted someone to applaud when you bought the cars, and someone to kick when the deals went bad. I was your emotional punching bag." She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face, looking for the man she had once loved. "I was willing to give you everything," she whispered. "When we started the divorce, I told Arthur I didn't want to hurt you. I was going to let you keep the company. I was going to let you keep the money. All I wanted was an apology. Just one moment where you admitted that I contributed to your success." Richard felt tears pricking his eyes, tears of frustration, of rage, of loss. I worked hard. "We worked hard," she corrected him. "But in that mediation room, when you mocked me, when you called me a leech, you broke the last thread, Richard. You showed me that you didn't just fall out of love with me, you despised me. And you can't build a future with a man who despises you." A low rumble interrupted them. A silver Aston Martin Vanquish pulled up to the curb, its engine purring with restrained power. The window rolled down, revealing a man with kind eyes and a jawline that spoke of old money and good breeding. "Ready, Henry?" the man asked. He didn't look at Richard with anger or judgment. He looked at him with indifference. Richard was just an obstacle on the sidewalk, a piece of debris to be navigated around. "1 second, Michael," Henry said. She reached into her purse. Richard's heart leapt. Was she going to give him a check? A key to a condo? Some lifeline to save him from the abyss? She pulled out a small velvet pouch. She opened Richard's hand, placed the pouch in his palm, and closed his fingers around it. "What is this?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. "The diamond earrings you gave me for our 10th anniversary," she said. "I had them appraised. They're cubic zirconia. You charged the joint account for real diamonds, kept the difference and gave me glass." Richard couldn't breathe. He remembered that day. He had used the extra money to put a down payment on a boat he never told her about. "Sell them," Henry said, her voice turning cold as ice. "They're worth about $50. It should be enough for a bus ticket out of town." She turned around, her crimson dress swirling around her legs. She didn't look back. She walked to the Aston Martin, the door opening for her, and slipped inside. Richard stood frozen as the car merged into the traffic, disappearing into the sea of red taillights. He looked down at the velvet pouch in his hand, then at the cardboard box. The wind picked up, cutting through his suit, chilling him to the bone. He was Richard Sterling. He was a CEO. He was a visionary. He sat down on the cold concrete steps of the building he used to think he owned, pulled the cubic zirconia earrings out of the pouch, and for the first time in 20 years, he wept. Not for the wife he lost, but for the pathetic, empty man he finally realized he was. And that is how the tables turned. Richard Sterling thought he was discarding a useless wife, but he was actually throwing away the only thing that was keeping his life together. He learned the hard way that arrogance is a loan with a very high interest rate, and eventually, karma comes to collect. What do you think? Did Henry go too far by taking his company, or did Richard get exactly what he deserved? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of ultimate revenge, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. We have a crazy one coming up next week about a gold digger who accidentally married her own boss's son. You don't want to miss it. Thanks for watching.